My dad fired me from our family orchard because I refused to restart an irrigation pump that was already tearing itself apart. My older brother Gavin called me dramatic. Dad said I was embarrassing him in front of the crew, and by sunset, I had been told to hand over my keys. 12 years later, during the hottest week our county had seen in decades, Dad called and said the orchard's water system was failing, and they needed me there before the next afternoon. Gavin got on the phone long enough to add one thing. Don't send us an invoice. You're still family. I grew up on Bellwether Orchard, 174 acres of apples, pears, and cherries that my grandfather had planted in sections over 40 years. Other families had vacations. We had harvest. Other kids knew which beach they went to every summer. I knew which pump fed the north block, which valve stuck after a cold winter, and which rows flooded if you opened the wrong two zones together. I liked it. That was the part my family never understood later. I had not been trapped there. I wanted the farm. Gavin wanted it too, but for different reasons. He was 5 years older and good at the parts of farming that looked impressive from a conference room. He could talk to buyers, negotiate packaging rates, and explain a 5-year plan with a slide deck. I was the one who could hear a motor running rough from 50 feet away. Dad decided that made Gavin management and me maintenance. For a while, I did not mind. I was 22, working full-time on the orchard and taking night classes in electrical controls at the community college. I figured the titles would sort themselves out eventually. The land needed both of us, and Gavin came home from a regional agriculture conference, obsessed with cutting operating costs. He had a spreadsheet showing that Bellwether spent too much on preventive maintenance compared with 3 larger orchards. I pointed out that 2 of those orchards had systems installed less than 5 years earlier. Ours had been expanded in layers since before I was born. He called that an excuse. First thing he cut was the spring service contract on the main booster station. That station pushed water from our reservoir into almost half the orchard. The motor was old but reliable if you treated it well. Every March, a local pump company inspected the bearings, seals, alignment, overloads, and pressure sensors. It cost money. It also kept a single failure from shutting down 90 acres at once. Gavin canceled it. By June, the motor had started making a high metallic whine under load. I logged the vibration and told Dad we needed to shut it down for inspection. Gavin said I was trying to prove his budget cuts were a mistake. 2 days later, the motor temperature jumped during the afternoon cycle. The overload relay tripped twice. I reset it once, watched the amperage climb again, and shut the station down. Gavin arrived 10 minutes later furious because the west blocks had only received half their scheduled water. "Restart it," he said. I told him no. He said he was the operations manager. I said the motor was pulling too much current and the bearing sounded bad. If we kept forcing it, we could turn a service call into a full replacement. Dad drove up while we were arguing. Gavin immediately framed it as a chain of command problem. He said every time he tried to modernize the orchard, I undermined him in front of employees. He said he could not manage if the mechanic got to veto him whenever he felt like it. I expected Dad to ask about the motor. Instead, he asked whether Gavin had told me to restart it. I said yes. Dad looked at me and said, "Then restart it." I remember staring at him because I genuinely thought I had misunderstood. "If it burns up, we lose the station," I said. "And if you keep refusing instructions, you lose your job." There were 6 seasonal workers close enough to hear him. Gavin folded his arms. Dad waited. I could have pushed the button. I could have let the machine make the decision for us. I did not. Dad told me to hand over my keys. By 6 that evening, I had cleaned out the metal locker in the maintenance shed. I had 2 toolboxes, 3 work shirts, a stack of class notes, and nowhere to put any of it except the back of my truck. Mom cried when I came into the house. Not because Dad had fired me, because I was making it bigger than it needed to be by leaving. Gavin stood in the kitchen doorway and said I would cool off in a few days. I asked whether the pump was running. He said yes. It seized before midnight. The pump company replaced the motor and one bearing assembly 2 days later. I did not know that at the time. Dad never called. Gavin never called. Mom sent one text telling me everyone was upset, and I should apologize before things became permanent. I slept in my truck behind a friend's machine shop for 3 nights because going back felt worse than not having a bed. On the 4th morning, June Caldwell found me brushing my teeth with a bottle of water behind the shop. June owned a smaller orchard about 15 miles east of ours. She was in her late 50s, had known my grandfather, and had the kind of personality that made lying to her feel like extra work. She asked why I was there at 6 in the morning. I told her the short version. She listened and asked one question. "Was the pump bad?" I said yes. "Then why are you acting embarrassed?" That afternoon, she gave me 2 weeks of work repairing frost fans and replacing damaged solenoids. 2 weeks became a summer. He introduced me to a contractor named Owen Park, who designed irrigation systems for vineyards and orchards across the state. Owen hired me because June told him I was stubborn about equipment in exactly the way a technician should be stubborn. I finished my controls certificate. Then I earned 2 manufacturer certifications. I learned variable frequency drives, soil moisture telemetry, fertigation controls, well management, filtration, and remote monitoring. I stopped thinking of irrigation as pipes carrying water and started seeing it as a system where every bad decision appeared somewhere else later. That idea applied to more than pumps. For the first few years, I avoided Bellwether completely. I took routes that added 20 minutes rather than drive past the orchard. I ignored birthdays. I sent Mom cards, but stopped answering calls when every conversation became a request to be the bigger person. Dad sent nothing. Gavin occasionally messaged when he needed a part number or remembered some wiring change only I had documented. I answered twice. Both times he acted like the 12-year-old argument had ended because I had responded to a technical question. After that, I stopped being free support. My career moved faster than I expected. Owen's company grew. I moved from service technician to project lead, then to regional field supervisor. In my early 30s, I was responsible for emergency response on large agricultural water systems across 4 counties. I was not rich. I was not secretly powerful. I was simply very good at the exact kind of work my family had decided did not count as management. June remained in my life through all of it. When Owen retired, she was one of the first customers who signed with the larger firm that hired me. Her orchard expanded slowly, and every few years we upgraded another section. That was why I was back in my hometown 12 years after Dad fired me. Caldwell Orchard had finally approved a full controls replacement. The job had been scheduled for months. We were installing new pump drives, pressure monitoring, and zone automation before the late summer heat arrived. The forecast changed halfway through the project. Instead of 3 warm days, we got a heat warning that stretched across the entire week. Daytime temperatures were expected to stay above 100 degrees, with hot wind in the afternoons. orchards carrying mature fruit. That was not the week you wanted unreliable water. On Monday morning, our dispatch board flagged an emergency request from Bellwether Orchard. I stared at the customer name for several seconds. They were not one of our regular accounts. According to the notes, their main irrigation controller was tripping, one booster pump was dropping pressure, and several west zones were not opening consistently. A request had been submitted by Dad. I told dispatch there was a family conflict and asked them to assign someone else. An hour later, my phone rang. Dad's name had not appeared on my screen in more than 8 years. I answered. He skipped hello. How fast can you get here? I told him I was on another job. This is not another job, this is home. I asked what the system was doing. For the next 3 minutes, he gave me symptoms. Some of them made sense. Some sounded like 3 separate problems being described as one. I asked whether anyone had checked the drive fault history. He said Gavin had reset it. I asked how many times. There was a pause. And he said, a few. That answer worried me more than any alarm code. I explained that our emergency dispatcher could send a certified technician. Because of the heat warning, response time was running longer than normal, but they would prioritize active crop loss risks. Dad said he did not want a stranger. You know this place? I said I knew what the system looked like 12 years ago. Then Gavin took the phone. His voice had changed less than I expected. We don't need a sales pitch. We need you here. Bring whatever parts you think you'll need. I told him the company would send a technician under an emergency service ticket. Fine, put yourself on the ticket. I said I would not because of the family conflict. He laughed once. Family conflict? Seriously, we're talking about apples dying in the field and you're doing corporate policy. I told him the policy protected everyone, including him. That was when he said it. And don't send us an invoice. We're still family. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in it. 12 years had passed, and Gavin still believed the problem with that day was that I had refused to do what he wanted. I handed the emergency request to one of our senior technicians, a woman named Renaa who had 20 years of pump experience and no history with my family. She called Bellwether within 15 minutes. They refused to authorize the emergency rate. That should have been the end of my involvement. It was not. That evening, while our crew was finishing the new pressure sensors at Caldwell, Tomas Reed drove onto the site. Tomas had been Bellwether's foreman when I left. He was 60 now, thinner, slower, but still wearing the same style of sun-faded cap. He waited until I climbed down from the control cabinet and then held out a thick envelope. You should have had this a long time ago, he said. Inside was a copy of the pump company's service report from 12 years earlier. The report said the failed bearing showed long-term wear. It said the motor had experienced repeated overcurrent events before seizure. It specifically noted that shutting the station down when the overload first tripped would likely have prevented the motor damage. My name was nowhere in the cause section. Dad's signature was at the bottom. I read it twice. Tomas said the technician had explained everything in the maintenance shed 2 days after I left. Dad knew I had been right before Mom sent me that message asking me to apologize. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. He looked ashamed. Your dad told everyone the report was family business. Gavin said you had been messing with the settings before you quit. I should have called you anyway. I asked why he was giving it to me now. Tomas looked across the road toward the hills where Bellwether sat out of sight. Because they're doing it again. He told me the current failure had not started that morning. The controller had been throwing intermittent pressure and motor temperature warnings for almost 6 weeks. Their previous service company had recommended replacing a failing drive fan and inspecting the pump. Gavin postponed it until after harvest because he did not want downtime. Then he disabled 2 notification rules because the alerts were filling his phone. The west zone valve problem was older still. Tomas had been manually opening 2 zones for nearly a month. The heat wave had not created the emergency. It had removed their room to keep pretending there was no emergency. I asked whether Dad knew. Tomas said yes. Not every detail. Enough. Then he told me the part that changed my decision from uncomfortable to simple. That afternoon, after Renaa gave them the emergency quote, Gavin had told Tomas to use a jumper to bypass one of the protective inputs on the drive. Tomas refused. Gavin told him he was replaceable. Tomas took off his cap. I quit an hour ago. For 12 years, I had wondered whether my family had ever understood what happened. Some part of me had imagined that time might have softened the story. Maybe Dad had been embarrassed. Maybe Gavin had matured. Maybe everyone had simply gone trapped behind pride. The envelope killed that version. They understood the pattern perfectly. They just still expected someone else to absorb the risk. Next morning, Dad arrived at Caldwell Orchard while I was standing with June and our electrician reviewing the final pump test. He walked straight past the safety cones. June stepped between him and the open cabinet before I could. You can talk from there, she said. Dad looked at her, then at me. You sent some woman to quote me $18,400 for work you could do yourself in a few hours. I told him Renaa was one of the best technicians in the company, and the quote included an emergency drive replacement if the diagnostics confirmed what we suspected. We don't need a new drive. Gavin reset it again and it ran for 20 minutes. I asked whether it was running now. He did not answer. I held up the old service report Tomas had given me. Dad recognized it immediately. That hurt more than I expected. You knew, I said. June glanced at me but stayed quiet. Dad rubbed his forehead. That was 12 years ago. You knew I didn't destroy that motor. I knew the bearing was bad. That doesn't mean you handled the situation correctly. There it was, not denial, not confusion. A revised accusation designed to survive the facts. I asked what correct handling would have looked like. He said I should have respected Gavin's authority and dealt with the disagreement privately afterward. After I restarted equipment I believed was failing, it was our farm. I said that did not make physics optional. Dad's voice hardened. He told me this was not the time to relitigate old family drama. The orchard had employees depending on it. My mother had her whole life tied up in it. The crop was at risk. He said if I cared about any of them, I would get in my truck, follow him home, and fix what needed fixing. I told him again that Bellwether could authorize our emergency service ticket like any other customer. He said, I am not paying my own son $18,000 to come home. I said he would not be paying me. He would be paying the company for technicians, parts, travel, and emergency priority. He pointed at Caldwell's new control cabinet. So you'll stand here making June's farm perfect while ours burns because she signs a check. June started to speak. I shook my head slightly. Dad looked directly at me. If you choose this place over your own family again, don't bother coming back to Bellwether, ever. For most of my 20s, that sentence would have cut me open. At 34, it sounded almost familiar. Understood. I opened our dispatch app and added a conflict note to Bellwether's account so no one could claim I had personally influenced their service. I asked dispatch to keep the emergency offer open under Renaa, and I went back to testing Caldwell's west pump. Dad stood there for another few seconds, then he left. Bellwether did not authorize the ticket that morning. Gavin tried to keep the system running himself. I know the sequence because the drive logged it all, and because 3 days later our company was finally hired to repair the damage. At 10:12, the main drive tripped on overtemperature. At 10:19, it was reset. At 10:41, it tripped again. Sometime after that, someone bypassed the external temperature input Tomas had refused to jump. The drive ran longer. Then one of the internal power modules failed. Now the repair was no longer a fan, inspection, and possible pump service. The drive itself had to be replaced. The correct unit was not sitting on a shelf in our county. Renat found one at a distributor 4 hours away, but another customer already had first claim on it. We could get the next unit the following morning. By then, parts of Bellwether had gone almost 3 days without normal irrigation during triple-digit heat. Trees did not die. Real life was less cinematic than that. But fruit quality dropped fast. Apples exposed on the southwest side developed sunburn. Some blocks lost size because the trees had been under water stress during a critical period. Packing house buyer who had contracted for premium-grade fruit reduced Bellwether's allocation after the first inspection. That single decision hurt more than the repair bill. Gavin started telling people I had refused to help because I wanted the farm to fail. He said it at the growers' cooperative office while trying to argue that Bellwether deserved more premium packing capacity despite the quality downgrade. Unfortunately for him, Renat was there discussing another customer's service schedule. So was the cooperative agronomist who had reviewed Bellwether's irrigation logs. Renat did not defend me personally. She did something worse for Gavin. She explained the timeline. 6 weeks of warnings, deferred service, disabled notifications, repeated resets, refused emergency authorization, protective input bypassed, power module failure. The agronomist added that Bellwether's fruit stress matched the irrigation outage and earlier inconsistent watering. Nobody yelled. Nobody needed to. The story became boringly technical, which is the worst possible thing for a lie built on drama. By Friday, Dad authorized every repair Renat recommended. I stayed off the account. Tomas did not return to Bellwether. He took a maintenance position with the cooperative's packing facility, and told me later it was the first job in years where nobody asked him to choose between doing something safely and keeping someone happy. Gavin lasted through harvest. The financial damage was serious but not fatal. Bellwether lost part of the premium contract, sold more fruit into lower-value processing channels, and had to delay a planned equipment purchase. The next season, Dad hired an outside farm manager for the first time in our family's history. Gavin called it a betrayal and quit. That part almost made me laugh. He had spent years insisting that authority had to be respected until authority belonged to someone else. Mom called me after he left. She said Dad was not doing well and asked whether I could come for dinner. I said I would meet them somewhere neutral. We chose a diner halfway between Bellwether and my house. Dad looked older than he had at Caldwell. Not dramatically, just tired in a way I had never allowed myself to imagine when I was younger. He brought the original service report. I told him I already had a copy. He said he knew. For a while, none of us spoke. Then Dad apologized, not perfectly. He started with explanations. Gavin had always been harder to manage. Gavin threatened to leave the farm whenever anyone challenged him. Dad had believed I was the dependable one, the one who would cool down and return. When the pump report proved I had been right, Dad said he felt trapped. If he admitted it publicly, Gavin would lose credibility with the crew. If he called me, he would have to admit firing me had been wrong. So he did nothing. I asked whether he understood what nothing had cost me. He nodded. I told him I had spent years thinking I had lost my family because I refused one unsafe instruction. He had known within 2 days that the instruction was bad and still let me carry the blame for 12 years. Mom cried quietly. Dad said, I thought you'd come home eventually. That sentence explained more than the apology. He had not believed losing me was permanent because I had always been the child who fixed things. Broken pump, stuck valve, bad wiring. Family argument, I was the repair department. I told him I accepted the apology for what it was, but I was not coming back to work at Bellwether. I would not manage it. I would not become the person they called when a decision became expensive. If we were going to have any relationship, it had to exist without a crisis attached. Dad asked whether that meant I forgave him. I said I did not know yet. For once, he accepted an answer he did not like. We started small after that. Birthday message, coffee every few months. Mom came to my house for dinner. Dad asked about work without asking for advice on his pumps. When Bellwether signed a preventive maintenance contract with another irrigation company, he told me afterward instead of asking me to review it. It mattered more than another apology would have. June's new system made it through the rest of the summer without a major failure. The following spring, her orchard hired 2 former Bellwether seasonal workers full-time when she expanded another block. It had nothing to do with that decision, but Gavin apparently told people I had orchestrated it anyway. By then, I did not care. Bellwether survived. Smaller, more cautious, and managed by people who kept maintenance schedules even when the numbers looked inconvenient. Gavin moved 2 states away and took a sales job with an equipment distributor. We have not spoken since the week of the heat wave. I used to think the satisfying ending would be Bellwether failing completely while I stood across the road watching. When I was 22, maybe I would have wanted that. What I wanted at 34 was simpler. I wanted the farm to stop needing my pain in order to function. The next summer, the first major heat warning came through in July. Out of habit, I opened our company's emergency dashboard before breakfast. Caldwell Orchard was green. Bellwether was not on our emergency list at all. Their new contractor had completed preventive service the week before. For the first time in 12 years, my family's orchard was handling its own problems, and nobody expected me to prove I loved them by fixing one. I closed the dashboard and went to work.